Hey, I'm Sooper. Welcome to my Meltdown. Marvel has had a massive success with combining their various properties in film in the last decade. Well, comics have been doing that pretty much since comics were invented, and there have been various examples in literature. Rights issues had made this really tricky for the movie business until recently. And once it got rolling, Marvel's cinematic universe has been very likely the most successful shared film universe of all time, having generated a cumulative $22+ billion. But these shared fictional settings in film trace back to long before Iron Man in 2008. So today I'm going to examine the variety of ways studios have tried to combine owned properties or public domain works and make the super groups of films. Universal really started this all off with Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 1943. Apocryphally, it started as a joke title from a screenwriter, but a producer took it seriously, so they greenlit a script to combine two of their big properties that had already made them millions from very low budgets. To be very clear here, I am going to poke and prod and make a lot of fun of a lot of these movies. And I love these movies, and they are absurd. These things are not mutually exclusive. If you can't handle total nonsense and a complete disregard for continuity between films, horror is not the genre for you. For example, if you try to make sense of the continuity and storyline between any two Friday the 13th movies, you're going to have a really bad time. That said, by the mythology of Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, werewolves are technically undead. Lon Chaney Jr.'s Lawrence Talbot character can't permanently die, so he's trying to find someone who can discover a way to kill him. As I've mentioned in a previous video, Bela Lugosi played Frankenstein's monster in this, and he portrayed him as able to speak, but blind. In editing, the studio removed all reference to this. He's only in a very small part of the movie anyway, and the meeting of the monsters is very short, and it's just the two of them, but it was still the first of its kind in combining two movie franchises this way. Also, it's got a few examples of how reusing actors in different roles gets weirdly meta. Bela Lugosi has been Dracula and Igor, and then turned into Frankenstein's monster. And he was the Romani who turned Lon Chaney into a werewolf. Why am I in different clothes? You're not. You're a different character, just roll with it. Okay. Lon Chaney has been the monster, the Wolfman, and Dracula, but they portray werewolves as immortal and only Lon Chaney because the werewolf played by Bela Lugosi is dead. And it happens a lot in these movies in particular. Those are just two actor examples. Next was House of Frankenstein in 1944. Boris Karloff returned, but this time as a mad scientist who revives the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, and Dracula. This was where they really started throwing everything into the mix. Dracula died very early in the movie by exposure to sunlight and never meets the other monsters. They establish that the Wolfman can be killed by a silver bullet shot by a loved one, and then that happens, and the monster and the scientist are both killed by quicksand. So naturally, the monster, Dracula, and the Wolfman are all back for 1945's House of Dracula, with another mad scientist trying to revive them all. Dracula shows up here with no explanation whatsoever, but also tells the doctor he wants to be cured of vampirism, and then they have a conversation about the fact that sunlight will kill him, except it already didn't kill him because that is what he supposedly died from in the last movie, and he knows it. The doctor has a theory that he can cure him with blood transfusions, which doesn't work. Dracula then uses his mind powers to knock out the doctor, reverse the transfusion, and turn the doctor into a vampire himself. Then the doctor uses sunlight to kill Dracula. In the scene where this doctor actually starts turning into a vampire, they have a shot of him in front of a mirror showing his reflection slowly fade until it's gone. And I have to give the movie credit because that was kind of a cool idea. The rest of the movie is honestly not great and ends up having the doctor cure lycanthropy through surgery because the real cause of lycanthropy is pressure on the brain apparently. Frankenstein's monster is here, but almost an afterthought who gets presumably burned to death in the last 2 minutes, which is the only part during which he's even awake. And that's the end of the classic Universal versions of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman, except for a comedic film in 1948, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This movie is maybe in continuity, maybe not. Just kidding. Death is meaningless and so is continuity. Yeah, those were very much the beginning of multiple film properties being squished together to form Voltron. And while it did slow down a little between the 60s and the 80s, once it picked up again, it just kept getting bigger and bigger. King Kong vs. Godzilla was done in 1962. It was only the third Godzilla film, but it had to date the biggest box office in Japan of any Godzilla movie, which is still true to this day. And it's credited by some as the reason they kept making Godzilla movies at all. And with the next film, Mothra vs. Godzilla, they began a long tradition of having Godzilla face off against other giant monsters that studio already owned. And that's something they're doing even now. There's even a remake called Godzilla vs. Kong scheduled for next year. 1987's Monster Squad is probably the most directly connected to the Universal franchise in spirit. Again, I'm okay, sure. In general, it's beloved by people who grew up with it, but it's also in a weird spot where it's a little too kiddie for older people, but in some places it's kind of too gory for kids, which resulted in it bombing badly in theaters. It's definitely gained a cult following after it got on home video, though. It was also co-written by Shane Black and is one of the few films he's written that doesn't take place at Christmas. And it's deeply obvious that it was made by people who are fans of the Universal movies, so much so that they have a nod to the armadillos in the Lugosi Dracula during the opening credits. It teams up Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, Frankenstein's monster, and the Gill Man. So in a sense, it reunites more of the monsters than Universal did. The Mummy in this isn't so faithful to the original Karloff film, but the rest are a lot more so. This mummy is just kind of a mindless drone in bandages, which is not really what the Karloff mummy is at all after about the first 2 minutes of that movie. But the Karloff mummy wouldn't have really worked for this unless they added a subplot of a power struggle between Dracula and Imhotep. Because it was a horror movie in the late 80s, it has a rap song over the end credits that was made for the movie. I don't know why this was a thing so frequently in that time period, but it was. Weird trivia fact, this rap song was written and performed by Michael Sembello, the guy who wrote the song Maniac for Flashdance, and Dick Rudolph, who is the father of SNL alum Maya Rudolph. Monster Squad is a movie that is fun nostalgia. Some bits don't age well. As with a lot of 80s movies, it has multiple casual homophobic slurs. But mostly I think it could be a neat way of introducing a kid to the genre if they're not willing to sit through a black and white movie. 1994 started Kevin Smith's Askewniverse, which is about the only shared film universe of comedies out there that I'm aware of. It varies in quality, but I like some of it a lot. It also features a lot of actors playing multiple parts. The early 90s planted a couple of seeds in mashups or versus films that wouldn't pay off for a decade, and depending on who you ask, didn't pay off well. The end scene of 1990's Predator 2 had what was at the time essentially a background prop gag of seeing a xenomorph skull on a Predator spaceship. It's also about the only thing anyone talked about after the movie came out, and it still is, because people were instantly like, I'd kill my own mother to see an Aliens vs. Predator movie. Then they made Alien vs. Predator in 2004, and Aliens vs. Predator Requiem in 2007, and we took it all back because they were not good. 93 brought the 9th entry in the Friday the 13th series, Jason Goes to Hell. I'm not even going to get into the actual plot of the movie here, but as with Predator 2, it had an ending with a spark of a new direction, with Freddy's gloved hand grabbing Jason's hockey mask and dragging it into hell. And that was an intentional nod to a proposed, at the time not going forward, Freddy vs. Jason film, and they thought this is the only way we're going to get a shot at even hinting at this. That film did eventually get made 10 years later, and I found it overall enjoyable, but not great. It's fun, but for me the Freddy series ends with Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Freddy vs. Jason had an alternate ending that was conceived but never filmed, where they end up in hell and have to be separated by Pinhead from the Hellraiser series, setting up a bigger fight for the next movie. But New Line didn't have the rights to Pinhead, and a sequel never happened. Personally, I think it sounds like that would have been kind of fun, but oh well. There is a comic series that they did where they continued the story, but with Freddy and Jason both fighting Ash from the Evil Dead series. Also in 2003 were two other mashups, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which contained a variety of literary characters from the Victorian era, which were mostly public domain, and Underworld, which has had like 5 movies. And it was initially subject to a lawsuit from White Wolf, the publisher of the World of Darkness role-playing games. This was settled out of court, but having been part of the role-playing game community at the time and heavily into horror conventions, that move really backlashed on White Wolf. There are a few slight similarities between the two, but White Wolf's setting is at best a mix of dozens of public domain bits and pieces and folklore combined with a goth punk aesthetic that they also did not invent and then just shoved it all into a blender. They also claimed in the lawsuit that Underworld's hackneyed Romeo and Juliet but with werewolves and vampires story was a total ripoff of their hackneyed Romeo and Juliet but with werewolves and vampires story. And I mean, even Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet wasn't an original story 4 centuries ago, so it's all kind of ridiculous. And I do get the argument that White Wolf's lawyers felt they needed to file suit because you can't hold a copyright that you don't protect, but it just left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. And after all that, Underworld is not really a great movie. It's fun to watch. Bill Nighy is in it, and he's a very old vampire who is so over the top with every line reading that he's amazing to watch, but the movie itself is not good. If you want to see a bunch of young, pretty people in gothic punk clothes, that's about what it's good for. The next year, Universal put out Van Helsing, which was kind of their attempt to do a revival of the original Monster Rally films, and it has some cool parts, but overall it isn't really good either, and it didn't do well enough that they wanted to make anything more of it as a series. Universal has tried again to make a series of connected reboots based on those old horror properties, but now they seem to think the way to go is standalone movies, which probably is a better way to go for them. Warner Brothers and DC Comics have seemed to come to a similar conclusion about their attempts to create a film universe to rival Marvel, since a lot of their connection attempts have been not great, but then the films themselves have been mostly misguided is the word I would use. I love a lot of DC Comics characters. I have not loved a lot of the movies they've put out in the last decade. I liked Wonder Woman. Shazam was a pretty pleasant surprise. And the end of Birds of Prey was good. I thought it took a little too long to get there, and I don't really like their Harley Quinn very much. But otherwise, a lot of the DC movies as a whole have not been great. I know Birds of Prey was subject to a ton of nerd rage on the internet because depending on who you talk to, it was either the best movie ever made or the worst movie ever made. And I'm here to tell you it was okay. The comics are far better. Though I would probably murder someone for the breakfast sandwich in the movie, and if you've seen it, you know what I'm saying because that thing looks delicious. One thing that seems to be the most common ending in the versus variant of these movies is either the end is left vague so us nerds can argue afterward about who really won and not get angry at the filmmakers for letting the wrong character win a fight in films like King Kong vs. Godzilla or Freddy vs. Jason. Less often, unless those fighting are supposed to be the heroes, the fight is evenly matched or just about to end up until some external force causes them to team up, like in Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. But this does leave the question, which is the best of these various team-ups and face-offs? And I don't know why you're asking, because the answer is obviously Sharktopus versus Whale Wolf. That's it. That's the video. If you liked it, hit the like button. If you didn't like it, you didn't watch this far into the video anyway, so why am I talking to you? Thanks for coming to my meltdown.